G'day, welcome to the channel. My name's Joden Cook. I am a service designer in Sydney, an avid outdoorsman and a bit of a Land Rover tragic. In today's episode, I'm going to walk you through my journey of taking my Perentie from a soft top through to a hard top using a Series 3 roof. Now this is something I get a question about almost every week, whether it's where I got the roof from, how I made the front fit the Defender rounded windshields, how I've waterproofed it, how I've capped it, all of those kind of things. So what I thought I'd do is I'd make a quick video walking you through that process from the very beginning, me finding the roof online, through to it being camp ready. Now before we jump into the process, I want to talk you through a few of the benefits I've found since going to a hard top over the soft top. First of all is the flap. Anybody who has a canvas on their Defender or Perentie will tell you that it flaps like crazy at anything over 30 kilometers an hour. So it makes it very difficult to hear what anyone's saying if they're speaking next to you in the passenger seat, and it's also just a bit annoying. Second thing is water ingress. Now I had the FFR, and that means that the original canvas had a rubber inner liner, so it meant that the water would never leak directly into the car, but you would get water between the outer layer of the canvas and that inner layer of rubber. So it's obviously not very good for mold, and also just not a very good look just driving around with a whole bunch of water sloshing around in your canvas, so good to get rid of that. The third one is roof rack options. Now of course Perenties come with their standard roof rack. I have mine here, sitting here behind me still, but it's not exactly what I was after, and you don't have very many options because most roof racks grab onto the sills on the side of the roof. So now that I have a roof, of course I have a lot of options for roof racks. Fourth is access. So if you've got a soft top or a canvas top, you'll know that you're constantly undoing ropes, tying them back up, especially when you're driving in dusty locations. Those ropes get very dusty and it's just a bit of a pain in the butt. So having a door that you can just open is a huge benefit. Now for the flip side of the coin, nothing in life is always rainbows and kittens, so there are some limitations and drawbacks. The first one I wanted to talk about is also access related. You go from, of course, having a lot of access when you've got the canvas, you can roll it up and get it out of the way, to having something which is much more limited. So you're going to be limited by the space that you have on the particular roof that you have. So you could have a full barn door, or you might have something similar to mine which opens at the top by swinging away, or potentially a cat flap. So that space is obviously limited by the fact that you've now got a hard roof in the way of moving anything out of the way. The second drawback is side access. So when you've got the canvas, you can roll up your sides, you can throw things in, throw them out. Yes, it's a bit of a pain to undo the ropes all the time, but you can do it. Having the hard top on, not an option. Third drawback for me, and this is only if you're using a series roof, is that you will have to chop it to make it fit around a windshield of a Defender, the round ones. Of course, you could also switch out the windshield to be a series windshield, but it's a lot narrower windshield, so you've got less vision and not something that I really wanted to do. Fourth and final drawback of the hardtop is light. So when you've got the FFR soft top, it's completely black out in there. Once you've closed it all down, it can be extremely bright sun's outside and you won't get any light inside whatsoever. Of course, once you've got windows, that's no longer the case. One additional benefit which I wasn't expecting from the hardtop was fuel economy. I actually found that I was able to get a little bit more out of every tank once I switched to the hardtop, so another added benefit. I've broken this whole process down into 10 steps, so it's fairly easy to follow, and I'll take you right through from finding a roof through to having it ready to go. Now the first thing you're going to have to do is find yourself a roof. Of course that sounds easy, but I promise you they are harder to find than you might think. I would recommend that you check out Facebook Marketplace, and in particular ask on Perentie pages or Land Rover Defender pages. You never know what someone might have lying around in their shed, so don't be afraid to ask the question. I found this particular roof on Marketplace for about $600, and the bloke I bought it from, Jono, was a great help by sticking it on a trailer and bringing it out to me, which was awesome. Now as you can see in the photos, it's not the best looking roof in the world. It had quite a lot of paint damage, as well as the fact that it had mosses and lichens growing all over it, but what I liked was the underlying structure itself was nice and straight and looked like it had been fairly well cared for, and that's what you want. Now I would recommend turning on notifications not only for the groups that you're in within Facebook, but also on Marketplace itself. So if and when somebody does post something like a roof for a Defender, you'll be first to know, and they tend to sell within a couple of hours, so you do want to get onto it pretty quickly. Step 2, of course, removing the canvas. Now this took me about an hour with the help of a mate, and just included a whole bunch of bolts and screws being taken out. So fairly straightforward, nothing too tricky, just work your way around taking everything off. Take the canvas off first and then start on the underlying structures. Okay, now on to step 3. Here's where you're going to lift the roof onto the truck itself and mark out any areas of the roof that you need to cut. So if you're going to be keeping the rollover protection structure on the Perentie, which I recommend that you do, you're going to want to mark those sections out. If you're going to be keeping the FFR radio mounts like I have, you'll also need to mark those sections out so that you know where to cut. Okay, so in this process of lifting the roof on is the first thing I would do differently if I were to do it again. I decided I would keep the sides on my roof. When it arrived, it was all bolted together, all the bolts were there, it looked quite clean, all the seals looked good, so I thought I'd keep it together to save on work of taking it apart and putting it back together. But what that meant was my measurements and cuts weren't quite right, because you can't get the roof to sit down on top of the truck bed entirely. So what I'd recommend is taking those sides off, sit them against the side of your truck as is, measure out the rollover protection structure that you're going to need to cut around if you've got a Perentie, or anything else that you might need to cut around to get it to fit your truck, and do it that way, and that'll give you a much more precise cut. So you might be asking yourself, Jordan, why would you keep the FFR radio mounts and the rollover protection structure and all those things which make this job a whole lot more difficult? The answer is the rollover protection structure for me was a must. Having handled this roof, I can tell you that if it did flip, it would flatten like a pancake, it wouldn't offer any protection whatsoever. So the rollover protection structure, although it's not the most robust rollover cage on earth, it's better than just the roof on its own. And when it comes to the FFR radio mounts, I store my high lift jack on one side, and I am planning to build a bucket of some kind of description on the other side to store water and fuel for longer trips. That also keeps my center of gravity low rather than having everything on the roof, and sometimes on more of the technical tracks you can obviously come into a bit of a tippy situation if you've got a lot of weight on top. And trust me, I've been in a couple of situations where if you had too much weight on top, I probably would have rolled, so quite thankful for having the weight stored as much as I can down low. On to step 4, which is cutting the roof. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you're using a county or defender roof, which has the rounded front for the windshield, you won't need to cut the front of the roof off, which is great because that's probably one of the scariest parts to cut. So what I used for the job is an angle grinder, fairly basic, with a very thin, as you can see, stainless steel cutting disc. This gives you a nice precise cut. It makes very short work of aluminium, as you would imagine, but also cuts through the steel ribbing very easily. I probably went through 4 or 5 of these discs. And the only thing I would caution, of course, wear all your PPE, but make sure that you're also stopping periodically to clean out this gunk, because aluminium is so soft it does tend to build up on the inside of your cutting implement. There's probably better cutting tools to use, but this is what I went with and it worked fine. Now, when it came to deciding which sections I would cut and would not cut, it was all about what I was going to be keeping on the truck. So of course the rollover protection structure over the driver's and passenger seat was going to be kept, but I actually decided to remove the rear rollover protection structure for a few reasons. First of which was it doesn't feel like it's particularly strong. It didn't go through to anything solid, it was just kind of screwed and bolted in there. And the other was I didn't want to cut too much ribbing away from the back of the roof because that's what keeps its structure. So the process I used to make the cuts was to make all of the internal cuts first. So I cut everything that needed to be removed in order for the roof to be sat on and sit flush to the top of the bed. So I made all of those cuts. Once that was done, I lifted the roof on, and that allowed me to get a very precise line for where I needed to cut for the front of the roof to fit around the windshield. And that's the part that you don't want to mess up. If you do cut too close to the driver's seat or cut too far back, then you can ruin the roof. One thing I did, which I would recommend as well to give you a little bit of wiggle room, I undid the bolts which hold the windscreen tilt in position, and I tilted the windscreen forward just a little bit, enough that I could still drive with it that way. And that way I could measure the roof, make the cut, and know that I still had a little bit of extra space to come back if I needed to. If I made the cut and it was fine, no need to worry about it, happy days, can move on. Once you've got the roof lifted in there and you have the windshield in the right spot, that's basically where I ran through with a marker and marked exactly where the roof was sitting in relation to the windshield. So that then gave me a very clear line as to where I needed to cut. For making that cut on the front of the roof where it's going to meet the windshield is by far the most precise cut. So what I did was, of course, lift the roof off. I used the line which I'd drawn once the roof was on the car to then clamp down some straight RHS, which gave me a nice straight line across the roof. Clamped that down nice and tight, and then just got the angle grinder and ran along the edge of the RHS, so it gave me a nice straight cut. The one thing I would absolutely recommend is that you make sure that you stay at a 90-degree angle to the roof, because that will give you a nice curvature as you cut around the sides of the roof. So making sure that you keep the cutting disc vertical, have the roof either upside down or right side up, sitting down, and just keep that cut nice 90 degrees. Cutting at a nice angle like that will make sure that the curves of the roof will be as accurate to the curve of the windshield that you can get. So a lot of people, when they're fitting a new roof to a Perentie or a Defender, they will use the canvas retainer, which looks a lot like this, because this is one, to make sure that it gives a nice fit to the top of the windshield. But what you do have to do in order to do that is cut down the top section here, this curve you can see there. You'd have to cut that down. And as I said, I don't want to make any cuts to any of the original pieces so that I can roll it back if I want to at some point in time. So I've decided not to use the canvas retainer. I've bolted directly to the top of the windshield. It's up to you what you decide to do. Either way, you're just going to have to make sure that you give a nice seal between either the roof and the windshield, or the windshield and the canvas retainer. As you can see on the canvas retainer here, it's already got that rubber stripping there, so that will do the job for you. If you do what I did, you'll have to replicate that. So once you've made the cut, making sure that you're keeping nice 90-degree angle, lift the roof back onto the car, make sure that you're getting a good meeting between the curvature of the roof and the curvature of the windshield. It should follow around quite nicely. If you do need to make an extra cut, as I said, the tilting of the windshield should give you a little extra wiggle room, so you can tilt it back a little bit more, reline where you need to, or remeasure, sorry, and mark where you need to cut, and then make the cut again, lift it back on. And just continue that process until you've got the cut that feels like it's working well for you. Okay, on to stage 5. So, you've got all the cuts done, the scariest parts out of the way, you're out of the woods. Now it's time to strip it all back. Now, of course, if you've got a nice paint job on your roof and you don't have to do it, then by all means skip this step, it's not important. If you've got a roof like mine, or if you're wanting to change the colour, then it's probably a good idea to strip it back, start from a bare metal and build up from there. Now this is once again something that I would do differently now that I've done it once. I messed around with a whole bunch of different stripping gels, different types of sanding discs, all those kind of things, wasted a whole bunch of time trying to figure out what would be the best way to get the paint and primer off the roof. Now what I found worked best, it was the fastest by far, was a steel wheel that I attached to my angle grinder. Now you can just get one of these from Bunnings, and it did very, very quick work of removing the paint and primer from the roof. I used not only my over-ear ear protection, but also the ear buds as well, just because it is so loud. It's like sanding a giant drum. I actually had my neighbours come and get quite grumpy with me for doing it. It took me a few days to get the sanding done, but like I said, the steel wheel on an angle grinder was by far the fastest, and it also allows you to get into some of the tighter gaps, so you can get right up into the corners that you need to strip everything out. Now there is some controversy around using steel on aluminium. The reason for this is because particles of steel can get caught in aluminium and cause rust later on. Now I'm aware of this and decided that I would do it anyway, entirely up to you though. The reason that I decided I would do it is because I'd already made cuts through steel, cutting through the ribs inside the roof, as well as of course the aluminium. So I decided I would do this because it was such a time saver. It was so much easier, and then at the end what I used is basically a cleaner to go through the whole roof and try and remove any kind of debris. Step 6, masking and painting. Of course you want to mask anything that you don't want to paint, and for me that was my window rubbers and windows. So for this I just used blue masking tape and plastic drop sheet that I got from Mitre 10. Now for the actual painting of my roof, I decided to go with a paint roller because I didn't have a compressor and I didn't think it was viable to buy one just for this job. I could have used rattle cans, but it's probably not the best thing for the environment, not that any of this necessarily is, but also it would be more expensive. So I just went with the paint roller and that worked out quite well for me. Okay, when it comes to choices of primers, make sure that you use something which is going to help prevent rust, especially if you used a wire brush like I did to sand the roof back. You just want to make sure that you have all bases covered just in case. I think I did about 3 or 4 coats of primer and I left those coats for 24 to 48 hours before following up with the top coat. On to colour choice. Now I went with a matte black just because I think it looks cool and I know it's fairly easy to live with, but I would say whatever paint colour you do go with, make sure that it's available in a spray can as well. I went with the Dulux Metal Shield Epoxy Enamel. I've used it on the truck before, so I know it's fairly hard wearing, but the main benefit for me is I know it comes in a spray can, so if I'm in the bush and I take a big chunk out of the side, I know I can spray it on and it blends in perfectly. Okay, step 7, the final lift on. A bit of a tip which I completely overlooked was to remove all of the masking before you lift on. I still have a little bit of masking stuck between the rollover protection structure and the window, so just make sure that you clear all that out. Pretty basic, but I kind of overlooked that one. So for this stage of the lift on, the main thing that you want to focus on is making sure that the back of the roof lines up with the back of the truck and that the door openings line up on the roof with the car. That's the most important thing. You'll find that you won't actually have the roof sitting down on top of the tray just yet, and that's fine. There's going to be a gap there. Don't worry about that, just focus on getting it to line up properly. To help me line everything up, I used some ratchet straps which I attached to my FFR mounts and then ran around the back of the roof, and that just snugged it forward to the right level that I wanted to keep it at. Okay, once everything is lining up, it's time to jump onto that front cut and weatherproof it. So as we've spoken about, the canvas retainer has its rubber liner in here, so we just need to replicate that to make sure that we're not getting any water in while we're driving through rainstorms. Okay, to achieve this, I used pinch weld with a weather sealed rubber liner on the inside, as well as a very thin sliver of Sikaflex on top of the windshield itself. So when those two surfaces meet, there's a great seal there. Step 8, lining with foam and drilling your bolt holes. So as I mentioned, you're focusing predominantly on getting the alignment right, and you will have a little bit of a gap between the roof and the Perentie itself. And that's where you want to stick in some kind of barrier or rubber. I use this stuff, which is round rubber EPDM sponge, which is 12mm by 38mm, and that fits in there quite well. But whatever you do use, just make sure that there's something in there to cushion the roof. Now to stick that down, I used a quick grip spray adhesive, a couple of sprays on top of the ute, and then a couple of sprays on the rubber itself, and then just stuck that down, and that helped it stay in place as I was starting to snug the roof down. Then go around and find exactly where you need to drill. Now, drilling in, the couple of things you want to look for is where you drill, you should be able to access to put a nut in underneath. You don't want to have to also cut a section out of the tray top itself or the ute top on the Perentie. You want to minimize any of that cutting. So try and only use slots that you can access with your fingers to stick a nut on the other side, underside. You could also riv nut in there, which was probably a better option. If I was to do it again, I probably would use riv nuts. Once you found the spots that you're going to attach your bolts, you go around and just drill those sections, going through not only the roof, but of course then into the underlying ute top itself. All you need to do now is stick the bolts in and suck everything down. Now I left the front until the last part because I wasn't entirely sure where the holes would line up. So I went around and bolted everything down in the roof. It's a good idea to use a star pattern, the same as any kind of fixing that you're putting down. You want to make sure that it's being sucked down in an even way. Once that's down, then you know exactly where you need to drill for the front of the roof. Now what I did was go in and look up from underneath, and you can see that there are existing bolt holes that the canvas retainer used, and I just stuck the drill up through those and then up through the roof itself. So I was a little bit worried about drilling through the roof because obviously you don't want it to be leaking. So it actually hasn't leaked, so I can confirm that this method works. So what I did was put rubber washers between the roof and a stainless steel washer, and then once that was all tightened up, as you can see in this graphic, it pinches together and it means that there's no opportunity for water to get through there. And that's actually worked really, really well. I've been super happy with it. I've been driving this in absolutely torrential rain and haven't had any leaks come through those holes, so that's actually worked really well. Much better than I thought, actually. The final step, which is sealing and Sikaflexing the lot. You will see there is a lot of Sikaflex online, and this is partly why I chose black, also because black is cool, but I just wanted to make sure that I could be fairly liberal with my use of Sikaflex. It's a very old roof, it's on a pretty rough car that shakes around a whole lot, so a good smear of Sikaflex around the whole lot is definitely goods. And of course around the front, even though it has the pinch weld there, I did add some additional Sikaflex to the corners where the cut is, because the cut is not 100% perfect. Even if you use a Defender roof, I think you can still have a little bit of gap on the sides. Mine was not very big. I've seen some people have slightly bigger gaps that they fill with expanding foam. Luckily mine was quite small, so I just used Sikaflex. So there you have it. That's been my story of how I converted from a soft top to a hard top using a Series 3 roof. Thanks for watching. I hope it's been helpful. I will probably be doing more Perentie videos in the future. I've recently just completed a recondition of my transfer case and sent a diff after finding a whole lot of copper come out in an oil change. So let me know if you would like to see a video on that. Probably a similar format. I didn't do a whole lot of filming as I was doing the things, but I certainly have a whole lot of part numbers, price lists, and the general process that I went through to do it. And I've now tested it on 2 tracks and it hasn't blown up and it's maintaining good temperatures. Happy days. Alright, see ya.